There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a dinner table when a man decides, mid-sentence, that the oldest person in the room isn't worth finishing the thought for. I know that silence intimately now. I've sat inside it. I've let it stretch until the candles burned low and the wine went warm. And I've watched a man I once tried to respect talk himself straight into the largest mistake of his professional life. One careful dinner party at a time. My name is Harold Mears. I am 63 years old. I drive a 2009 Buick LeSabre with a cracked sun visor and a passenger seat that tilts 2 degrees to the left. I have worn the same brand of flannel shirt, in rotation, for 11 years. I mention these things not as apology, but as context. Because what follows is a story about what happens when a man looks at those details: the old car, the faded flannel, the quiet way I let other people fill a room, and concludes that he has seen everything there is to see. He hadn't. He never did. I spent 31 years in commercial real estate, not the kind with ribbon cuttings and cocktail parties, though there were some of those. The kind with zoning boards and environmental assessments, and the particular art of finding value in land that everyone else had written off as impossible. My partner, Dennis Okafor, and I built Mears Okafor Capital the way most things worth building get built. Quietly, methodically, and over a time horizon that made impatient people nervous. By the time I stepped back from day-to-day operations 8 years ago, we controlled or co-managed 14 commercial properties across 5 states. I say stepped back because retired implies a kind of finality I was never interested in. I still consult. I still sit on 2 boards. I still talk to Dennis on Tuesday mornings, which is a ritual that has outlasted 2 recessions and 1 of his marriages. But none of that shows when you look at me in my driveway. None of it shows over dinner. My daughter Caroline married Marcus Webb 3 years ago. I want to be clear. I liked Marcus initially. He is an organized man, decisive. He has the kind of confidence that reads well in professional photographs and slides easily through networking events. He had worked his way up, genuinely worked, I want to be fair, through a regional logistics firm called Callaway Distribution, and by the time he met Caroline, he held the title of Chief Operations Officer. Impressive. I told him so, the first time we sat across from each other, at a steakhouse downtown that he chose and that I paid for without comment. He had looked pleased. He had told me, modestly, that he was angling for the CEO seat when old Glenn Calloway finally stepped aside. I had nodded. I had cut my steak and listened, the way I have always listened. Not for what people say, but for what they assume is safe to say in front of me. There is a specific skill you develop when you spend 3 decades negotiating. You learn to hear the architecture of a conversation, not just its furniture. You learn which silences are comfortable and which are performed. Marcus, I noticed, was very good at performed silences. He knew when to pause for effect. He knew when to lower his voice just slightly to make the next sentence feel like a confidence. He was, in the language of the industry I came from, very good at managing up, at presenting the right version of himself to whoever was in the room. What he did not yet understand, what he would spend the next 2 years failing to understand, was that managing up requires knowing who is above you. He did not know. My neighbor Frank Abernathy, who keeps an immaculate vegetable garden and has never once, in 14 years of adjacency, beaten me at chess, told me last spring that I was the quietest man he had ever seen command a room. I told him I didn't command rooms. He laughed and went back to his tomatoes. We are not men who chase compliments. But I have thought about what he said more than once, because there is something true in it, and something useful. I do not command rooms. I watch rooms. I watch them the way I learned to watch parcels of land when I was 28 and trying to understand why certain properties appreciated while identical ones on the next block didn't. The answer was almost never the property itself. The answer was almost always the invisible things, the drainage patterns beneath the surface,
The zoning amendment 3 meetings back that no one remembered. The neighbor who had been quietly buying up adjacent lots for a decade. I drive that old Buick because it runs. It has always run. I had a mechanic once, a man named Terry Delacroix, who worked out of a converted gas station on the east side, who told me that most cars quit because their owners stop paying attention before the engine tells them something important. I have thought about that for years, in contexts that have nothing to do with cars.
Most things fail because someone stopped paying attention before the system sent its signal. I have never been good at stopping. The first time Marcus talked about me as though I wasn't in the room, I was in the room. It was a Sunday, about 8 months after the wedding. Caroline and Marcus had come for dinner, a routine that had settled into once a month, comfortable, pleasant. My wife Elaine doing most of the cooking while I set the table and opened wine. Marcus had brought a bottle of something that probably cost $40 and had been selected, I suspected, with some care about the impression it would make. I had accepted it graciously. I am not immune to a good bottle of wine. We were sitting in the living room before dinner, Elaine and Caroline in the kitchen, and Marcus was explaining, with the comfortable authority of a man among subordinates, the details of an acquisition Callaway was pursuing. A mid-sized company in the Carolinas.
Distribution infrastructure, mostly, with some warehousing capacity that interested them. He was articulate. He knew the numbers. He was, I have to say, genuinely good at his job in certain specific ways. And then his phone buzzed, and he glanced at it. And he set it face down on the coffee table with a small, private smile that he did not explain. "Sorry," he said, "acquisition stuff." "No need to apologize," I said. He looked at me for a moment, not unkindly, but with something in his expression that I would learn to read very well over the following months. A specific quality of patience. The patience you deploy for someone who doesn't need to understand what's happening, but who deserves to be treated with basic courtesy. He nodded and then continued his story, and somewhere in the second half of it, he shifted almost imperceptibly. The way a man shifts when he decides the audience has contracted. Still talking, still performing, but no longer for me. I drank my wine. I said nothing. I stored the signal. It is a skill, this, the ability to store a signal without responding to it. Terry Delacroix, the mechanic, was very good at this. He would hear a sound in an engine and nod, almost to himself, and continue the conversation, and then, 3 or 4 minutes later, return to the sound with a single precise question. That was the right interval. Long enough to seem unhurried, short enough to let the other person feel heard. I have never been able to explain why this particular cadence matters so much, except that it does. People relax when they think you're not investigating them, and a relaxed person shows you everything. Over the following year and a half, Marcus showed me a great deal. There was the dinner at his colleague Brian Faber's house, where Marcus introduced me to Brian's wife as Caroline's father, retired, with a warmth that was entirely genuine and entirely reductive, and where I spent most of the evening listening to a conversation about the logistics industry, while contributing, at measured intervals, comments that were received with polite disinterest. There was the holiday gathering at their apartment, where Marcus told a story about a silent partner type at his firm, someone who had more money than sense about the day-to-day, while standing close enough to my chair that I could smell his aftershave. There was the March evening when he referred to the commercial real estate sector as a dying industry, honestly. A lot of these old guys just holding on to properties they don't know what to do with, and laughed with Brian Faber over video chat while I poured myself another glass of water. I poured slowly. I did not respond. I stored. There was the specific evening, a Thursday in early April, almost exactly 2 years after the wedding, when Marcus, in good spirits after what he described as a breakthrough quarter, told Caroline at their kitchen table, while I was in the next room waiting for a cab, that I was a good man, honestly, just a little out of his depth with the business stuff. Caroline had said something I couldn't hear, Marcus had laughed. "No, I know, It's sweet how interested he seems. He asks good questions." And then, quieter, "He just doesn't have the context." The cab arrived. I went home. I sat in the kitchen with a glass of cold water and thought about context for a long time. I thought about the word specifically, context, as though it were a country with a border, and some people had visas and some didn't, and the man at the door was the one who got to decide.
I thought about the properties I had sold in 2007, before the market turned, because I had been paying attention to signals that other people dismissed as noise. I thought about the zoning change I had seen coming in the Westbrook corridor 18 months before anyone else in the city had read it correctly, and the parcel of industrial land I had purchased accordingly, and the number on the check I received when we sold it. I thought about the Tuesday morning conversations with Dennis. I thought about the 14 properties, and then I thought about Callaway Distribution. Here is something about commercial real estate that most people don't know unless they are in it. The industry is small. Not small in terms of money. The money is enormous. Small in terms of the people who move it. The actual principals, the ones making decisions about large-scale acquisitions and long-term holds, know each other. Not always well, not always warmly.
But they know each other the way a particular tree knows the shape of the soil around it, through contact, through competition, through the invisible negotiations of a shared ecosystem. Glenn Calloway and I had met 4 times over the course of my career. The first time was at a conference in Chicago, 19 years ago. The second was at a dinner for a mutual associate who was being honored by a local business organization. The third was a chance encounter at an airport that turned into a 90-minute conversation about warehouse infrastructure in the Midwest and the particular difficulty of finding contractors who understood cold storage requirements. The fourth was, at the time, recent. 6 months earlier, Glenn Calloway had reached out to Dennis with a question about a property in Charlotte, a warehouse complex we had sold 3 years prior, and that had, through a series of transactions I won't detail, ended up in his orbit. He wanted background on the environmental compliance history. Dennis had given him my number. Glenn had called on a Wednesday evening. We had talked for 40 minutes. At the end of the call, he had paused and then said something that I had filed carefully, the way I file most things. "Mears," he said, "I think I'm finally going to step back this year. You know anyone who can run a distribution company without breaking it?" I had said I'd think about it. I had thought about it. Slowly, in the way that decisions involving other people's organizations require. I had asked Dennis to look quietly at Callaway's publicly available financials. I had had a longer conversation with a logistics consultant I trusted, a woman named Renata Voss, who had spent 20 years restructuring mid-size companies and who had a way of describing organizational problems that made them feel immediately legible. Renata had said, after 20 minutes on Callaway, "It's a good bones company. The operations side is strong. Leadership succession is the issue. The guy in COO has the right skill set, but I'd want to know how he handles pressure he didn't anticipate." I had said I'd keep that in mind. The dinner that changed the coordinates happened in May. Caroline and Marcus were hosting. Their apartment, which is large and carefully furnished, and reflects Marcus's specific taste for things that look expensive without being ostentatious, which is its own kind of ostentation. There were 6 of us. Caroline and Marcus, Brian Faber and his wife Deanna, a couple I didn't know well named the Holloways, and me. Elaine had been traveling for a family obligation and sent her regrets. I drove the Buick. I parked it, as I always did, in the visitor's lot, where it sat among a cluster of late-model SUVs with the unconcerned dignity of a dog at a cat show. Marcus greeted me at the door with the warmth he always extended. Genuine affection wrapped inside a particular management of expectation. He took my jacket. He introduced me to the Holloways. He poured me a glass of wine and guided me, gently, toward a conversation about local road construction that was happening near the apartment. This was, I had come to understand, his preferred territory for me. Local, domestic,
adjacent to expertise without touching it. I was good at road construction conversations. I asked about the timeline. I mentioned the disruption to the parking situation. I was entirely satisfactory. Dinner was excellent. Caroline had cooked. Marcus had curated the wine, which she discussed with an attention that I respected, even as I noted its function. He was comfortable.
Comfortable in a way that comes from being in charge of the room, not through declaration, but through the small, invisible architecting of who sits where and who is asked what, and which topics receive the full warmth of his attention, and which are acknowledged and gently redirected. The conversation moved, inevitably, to Callaway. Glenn's retirement had been announced 2 weeks earlier. The search for a CEO successor was underway. Not public exactly, but visible to anyone paying attention. Marcus was, in his way, gracious about it. He didn't claim the seat as his, but he referenced it the way a man references a train he knows is coming. Not because he has a ticket, but because he's standing at the right platform. Brian asked direct questions. Brian was always direct. And Marcus answered them with a calibrated modesty that conceded uncertainty while projecting readiness. He was very good.
At some point, the Holloway husband, David, I believe, turned to me and asked, in the slightly too loud voice of a man who believes he is being inclusive, whether I had much experience with logistics. Marcus, before I could answer, said pleasantly, "Harold's real estate, David, commercial side, but he's been out of it a while." He smiled at me. Bit of a different world. I smiled back. "Somewhat different," I said. David Holloway nodded with the satisfied look of a man who has received the expected confirmation. I finished my wine. I asked Caroline, across the table, about a book she had mentioned 2 weeks earlier. We talked about the book for several minutes. The conversation moved. The evening continued. At the end of the night, Marcus walked me to the elevator. He shook my hand warmly. He said it had been great to have me. He said Elaine's absence was felt. He was entirely sincere.
That was the thing about Marcus that I always had to remind myself to hold correctly. He was not cruel. He was not malicious. He had simply looked at the visible information, the car, the flannel, the quiet, the retirement, and concluded that the picture was complete. He was a man who was very good at reading rooms, and he had read this one incorrectly from the first evening, and he had never had a reason to revise the reading. I rode the elevator down. I walked across the parking lot. I sat in the Buick for a moment before starting it. The cracked sun visor was pale in the lot lights. The passenger seat sat at its 2-degree tilt. I started the engine, which caught immediately, as it always did. I drove home. I called Dennis. Dennis Okafor answered on the second ring, which meant he was awake and had expected the call, which meant he had been thinking about the same thing I had been thinking about, which is one of the things that makes a 31-year partnership survivable. "You talked to Glenn," I said. "I talked to Glenn," Dennis said. There was a pause. Outside the window, the neighborhood was dark and still. A sprinkler system in the yard across the street clicked on, ran for 30 seconds, clicked off. "He wants to know if you'd sit on the selection committee," Dennis said. "Advisory capacity." "I know," I said. "He mentioned it in February." "And?" I thought about the dinner table, the gentle redirection toward road construction, the slight smile that said, "Bit of a different world." I thought about Renata Voss, saying I'd want to know how he handles pressure he didn't anticipate. "Tell him I'll do more than sit on the committee," I said. Dennis was quiet for a moment. "How much more?" "Enough," I said. Dennis made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more the exhale of a man who has been waiting for a particular answer and is relieved to have finally received it. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since November," I said. "Why November?"
I thought about the holiday gathering, the silent partner type, the money more than sense. "Something I heard," I said, "just a signal." What followed happened over 6 weeks, and it happened quietly, the way the most consequential things do when the person managing them has has learned that speed and noise are often the same mistake. I had 2 more conversations with Glenn Calloway, one over the phone, one in person, at a restaurant in his city, where I arrived in the Buick and he arrived in a town car, and we both pretended not to notice the difference. I had a longer conversation with Renata Voss, during which she walked me through Callaway's organizational structure in more detail and offered a specific assessment of the COO position and the man who held it. Her assessment was not unkind. It was accurate. I reviewed the documents Glenn sent. I spent 3 evenings with a financial analyst named Carl, who had worked with me on 3 acquisitions in the 2010s, and who had the particular gift of finding, in a stack of documents, the one number that changed the meaning of all the others. Carl found 2 such numbers in Callaway's internal projections. Neither was disqualifying. Both were worth understanding clearly before making any commitment. I had a phone call with Dennis about our existing holdings and our current consulting agreements, and whether the particular involvement I was considering would create any conflicts. Dennis said no, provided the structure was right. We spent 40 minutes making sure the structure was right. I did not tell Caroline any of this. I did not tell Elaine, who is a perceptive woman and would have understood immediately and asked excellent questions that I was not yet ready to answer carefully. I did not tell anyone in Marcus's orbit. I kept my own counsel, which is not the same thing as secrecy.
It is the condition under which decisions of any real weight are made correctly. On the 3rd Tuesday in June, I drove to Callaway Distribution's corporate office. The Buick performed without complaint. I wore the gray flannel shirt that Marcus had once described to Brian, in a phone call I was not meant to hear, as very Harold. I parked in the visitor's lot and walked inside and met with Glenn Calloway and 2 members of his board. The meeting lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, Glenn shook my hand and said he was glad this was happening. I said I thought it could be useful. I meant it in the specific, non-ornamental way that I mean most things. 3 days later, my name appeared formally and with appropriate legal weight on a consulting agreement with Callaway Distribution. My role? Senior Strategic Advisor to the board, with specific input into the leadership transition process. Not a figurehead position, a working one. I was, in the language that would eventually reach Marcus Webb, now one of the people who had input into whether he became CEO. Not the only person, not the final word, but a voice in a room he had believed, for 2 years, contained no one who mattered. If you've been listening to these stories for a while, if you've spent time here, then you know what they're built on. They're not built on revenge. They're not built on the satisfaction of watching someone fall. They're built on something older and quieter. The idea that what you are eventually surfaces, regardless of how carefully it's been covered over. That patience is not passivity. That the people who look through you are usually, in the end, looking through a window. If this reaches you, if the idea of a quiet man who doesn't announce himself feels familiar, take 10 seconds. Subscribe. Leave a comment about a time someone underestimated what you knew. We'll be here. And now, back to Harold.
I did not engineer what happened next. I want to be precise about this, because the story is easier to tell as engineering, as a careful plan, executed by a man who knew exactly where he was going. And while some of that is true, some of it is simply the way situations develop when you stop trying to control them and start paying honest attention. I was brought onto the Callaway Committee to provide genuine input. I provided it. The conclusions that input helped reach were the conclusions that the information supported. That is not a comfortable thing to say if you are looking for a simpler narrative, but it is the accurate one. Marcus Webb was reviewed, along with 4 other internal candidates, over the course of the summer. I read his file. I spoke with his direct reports in my advisory capacity during a round of confidential interviews that Renata Voss facilitated. I reviewed his performance metrics. I read the projections he had authored and the ones he had approved. I paid particular attention to 2 quarters in which he had made decisions under time pressure, because Renata's original observation, "I'd want to know how he handles pressure he didn't anticipate," had stayed with me the way useful questions do. What I found was not that Marcus was unqualified. He was qualified in many important ways. What I found was more specific. There were 3 decisions over 18 months in which he had received accurate early signals about developing problems, from line managers, from data, from one external consultant's report, and had not acted on them until the problems were significantly more expensive to address. Not because of negligence, because of a particular kind of certainty. A certainty about what the picture already was, which made it harder to see that the picture was changing. I wrote a 2-page assessment. I did not editorialize. I cited the 3 decisions.
I cited the specific signals that had been available and the timeline of the response. I gave it to Glenn and the 2 board members. I said I believed Marcus was a capable COO and that there were legitimate questions about his readiness for the CEO seat at this particular moment in the company's development. I said it was the board's decision, and I had given them my honest read. Renata called me the following week and said, "Your note was very clean." I said I'd had a good teacher. She laughed and said she hadn't taught me anything, which was mostly true. The decision took another month. I was not present for it. I received a call from Glenn on a Friday afternoon, informing me that the board had selected an external candidate, a woman named Sandra Osei, who had spent 12 years at a larger logistics firm, and whom I had, in a separate conversation, recommended as worth considering. I said that sounded like a good outcome. Glenn said he thought it was.
He said Marcus had been informed and had taken it professionally. He said there was a possibility of a different senior role in the restructured organization, if Marcus wanted it. I said that sounded fair. I sat in the kitchen for a while after that call. The coffee in my cup had gone cold while we were talking. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator made its low hum. Outside, through the window above the sink, I could see the corner of Frank Abernathy's garden. The tomatoes he had been so proud of all summer, heavy on the vine, ready. Caroline called me on a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after the announcement. She had known for 2 weeks. Marcus had told her immediately, which I respected. She had not called me until now, which told me something about the interval she had needed. "Dad," she said. "Hey," I said. There was a pause. I waited. I have always been good at waiting. "Marcus said your name was on the advisory committee," she said. "The one for the CEO selection."
"It was," I said. Another pause. Longer. I could hear in the background the particular quiet of their apartment in the evening, the low sound of something on television turned down. "Did you know?" she said. "When you were at our dinners? All those dinners. Did you know you were going to be involved?" I thought about how to answer that precisely. I knew Glenn was looking at a transition. I'd spoken to him once before about it. I didn't know, at those dinners, that I would be on the committee. That came later. "But you knew you might be." "I thought it was possible," I said. The silence this time was different. Not angry, absorptive. The silence of someone rearranging a room they thought they understood. "He never asked you anything," she said finally, "at any of those dinners. About work? About the transition? He just—" She stopped. "He treated me well," I said. "He always treated me with respect." "Dad?" "He did, in his way." "In his way," she repeated, and I could hear the specific weariness of a woman who knows both the men she loves and knows exactly what that phrase contains. "Were you ever going to tell us?" "Tell you what?" "Any of it. That you were still active. That you had a relationship with Glenn Calloway. That you were— I didn't know. I didn't know what you were still doing. I thought you were mostly retired." I thought about this carefully. Your mother knows the broad shape of it, I said. I'm not hiding my life from anyone. I don't need dinner parties to understand who I am. A long silence. Then, quietly, he's going to figure out you were on the committee. He probably already has. Probably, I said. Is that okay? It's accurate, I said. That's enough. She was quiet for another moment. Then, he's not a bad man, Dad. I know, I said. I never thought he was. I know, I said again, more gently. It's okay.
We talked for another 30 minutes about other things. Her work, a trip they were considering, the garden I had been neglecting. At the end, before she hung up, she said, "You could have said something. At any of those dinners. You could have just told him." I thought about this, about the dinner table and the road construction conversation, and the bit of a different world, about the precise quality of patience that says, "I have already decided what this is." He wasn't asking, I said. Marcus called me on a Tuesday. I was in the car, heading back from a meeting with Dennis. The old Buick on the freeway, the sun visor throwing its crack of shadow across the dashboard. I saw his name on the phone and pulled off at the next exit before answering. "Harold," he said. "Marcus," I said. There was a pause. I could feel him organizing himself, the particular steadying that a capable man does when he is about to have a conversation he has been preparing for, and has not fully been able to prepare for. "I wanted to call and I found out you were on the advisory committee for the Callaway transition." "Yes," I said. "I didn't know that. When we were having dinner, all those—" "I didn't know." "No," I said, "you didn't." Another pause. The car was parked on a side street now, under a large oak. Afternoon light came through the leaves in the uneven way it does in summer, shifting. "Can I ask," he started, and then stopped, started again. "Was your assessment, did your input—" He couldn't quite finish it. I waited. "Did it go against me?" he said finally. I thought about how to be honest without being unkind, and realized those were not, in this case, in conflict. "My assessment raised some questions," I said, "about specific decisions. I didn't recommend against you. I raised questions."
What kind of questions? About how you respond to early signals that contradict an established picture. A long silence. Long enough that I could hear the ambient noise of wherever he was. Outside, I thought. A slight wind. "That's very specific," he said. "It's a specific thing," I said. He stopped. "I didn't know you had that kind of background. With Callaway specifically. With commercial real estate connections. I didn't realize. I thought you were mostly retired." "I know," I said. The pause this time was different. There was something in it that I recognized. Not shame exactly, but its more constructive neighbor. The moment of recalibration. The moment when a smart person begins the work of revising a picture they held with too much certainty. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for how I treated you. At the dinners. I didn't take you seriously as a—" He stopped again. "You treated me well," I said. "I mean that." "I patronized you."
"A little," I said. "It's not unusual." Another silence. "I didn't ask you anything," he said. "About the industry, about Callaway, about— I just assumed." "You assumed based on what you could see," I said. "That's not unreasonable. It's just incomplete." "How long have you known Glenn Callaway?" "About 19 years. The sound he made was not quite a laugh, more the breath of a man adjusting to altitude. 19 years. "We don't run in the same circles usually," I said. Commercial real estate and logistics only overlap in specific places. But they overlap. They do. He was quiet for a long moment. Sandra Osei is good, he said finally. I've looked at her record. She's the right choice. I think so, I said. Glenn offered me a role in the new structure, SVP of Operations. I heard. Was that? He paused. Did you have input into that? No, I said. That was Glenn's decision entirely. I think it's the right one, if you want it. You're good at operations.
Another silence. Outside the oak, a car passed. The leaves moved. "Thank you for being straight with me," Marcus said. "That's all I can offer," I said. We talked for a few more minutes, careful, honest, neither of us working toward a particular outcome, just two men having a conversation that had been needed for a while. When we hung up, I sat in the car for a moment under the oak tree. A squirrel crossed the hood, briefly, and disappeared into the branches. I started the engine. There was a Tuesday morning in September that I returned to sometimes. Dennis and I were on our usual call. The coffee was hot. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator's hum. We talked about a property in Nashville that had some interesting complications and a parcel in Colorado that did not. We talked about a board meeting in October that I was not looking forward to but would attend. We talked about Dennis's second grandchild, who was expected in November and had not yet decided on a name or, apparently, a direction. Near the end of the call, Dennis said, "How's the family?" "Good," I said. "Marcus took the SVP role." "Smart move." "It is," I said. "He's good at what he does. He'll be better at it now." Dennis made a non-committal sound. "You think you'll be okay?" I thought about the phone call under the oak tree. The particular sound of a man revising a picture. "Yes," I said. "He's a smart person. He just needed the picture to shift." "Most people do," Dennis said. "Most people resist it," I said. "He didn't?" "Not entirely," I said. "No." There was a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have been talking every Tuesday for 3 decades and know when something has been said that doesn't need following. Dennis and I have that specific fluency. It is one of the things I'm most grateful for. "The Buick's still running?" he said.
Perfectly, I said. When are you getting a new car? When this one stops running. Harold, Dennis said, with the patience of a man who has had this exact exchange perhaps 47 times. Dennis, I said. We hung up. I finished my coffee. Through the kitchen window, Frank Abernathy's tomatoes were still there. Past peak now, a few gone soft, but most of them still solid on the vine. He had told me, 2 weeks earlier, that it had been a good year for them. Something about the drainage and the amount of sun and the specific variety he'd chosen. He'd talked about it for 15 minutes while I listened, and it had been entirely satisfying. I am 63 years old. I drive a 2009 Buick LeSabre with a cracked sun visor. I wear flannel shirts in rotation. I sit at the far end of dinner tables and ask about road construction, and let other people fill rooms and manage the impression I make by making very little effort to manage it. These things are not a disguise.
They are not strategic humility or carefully maintained low expectations. They are simply how I am, a man who learned over 31 years of paying attention to land and numbers and the invisible patterns beneath surfaces, that what you actually have is rarely the same shape as what you're willing to show. Marcus Webb is by all accounts settling well into his SVP role. Caroline tells me he is energized by it, that the narrower scope has clarified things for him, that he is doing work he finds genuinely satisfying rather than work that represents a destination he felt obligated to reach. I believe this. He is a good man. He always was. He simply had a version of the picture that was missing some information, and now it has more. Sandra Osei called me once, in October, to introduce herself properly and to ask a specific question about the Charlotte property that Glenn had originally called about. She was precise and well prepared, and ended the call in exactly the amount of time it needed. I thought this was the right choice. Elaine, when I finally told her the whole story, sat across from me at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You could have just told him, at one of those dinners. Just mention Calloway." "He wasn't asking," I said. She looked at me with the specific expression she has been deploying for 35 years, equal parts exasperation and recognition. "You are the most stubborn man I have ever met," she said. "I'm patient," I said. "Those are not the same thing." "Sometimes they are," I said. She shook her head, but she was smiling. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Outside, the evening had come down over Frank Abernathy's garden, and the last of the tomatoes were dark shapes on the vine, and somewhere on the street a car passed with its windows down, music fading. My father told me when I was about 22 and had just made my first significant professional mistake that the most dangerous thing about certainty is not that it makes you wrong, it's that it makes you stop looking. A wrong man who knows he might be wrong will eventually find his way to the right answer. A certain man who believes he already has it will stand in front of the right answer for years and see only confirmation of what he already knows. I have tried for 40 years to remember to keep looking. At the dinner table, at the parking lot, at the old car that the new parking lot does not know what to do with, at the quiet man at the far end of the table who is asking once again about road construction. He is looking back. He has always been looking back. He signed the paycheck. He will sign the next one too.